Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am a professor of English at Stanford University. Today, I'm going to be looking at TAYEB Salih's Season of Migration to the North in relation to Shakespeare's Othello and Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. On first reading, the dual settings of Season of Migration to the North seem to have little in common with each other, except as mediated through the character of Mustafa Sa'eed, who migrates from Khartoum in Sudan as a 12-year-old to study in Cairo, then proceeds to Oxford and London, then back to Wad Hamid in Sudan, a village in which he settles after 7 years in prison for murdering his English wife. The narrative is staged as Mustafa Sa'eed's retelling of his life story to an unnamed narrator who has similarly returned to Wad Hamid after 7 years studying poetry in England. The narrator is a native of the village rather than an outsider like Mustafa Sa'eed. The two men's shared affinity for English poetry is what originally brings them together, but by the end of the novel, we find that the narrator's own unexamined attitudes to his village are deeply shaken by the story he has heard. Mustafa Sa'eed's life story is sometimes conveyed to us in the form of a straightforward dialogue between the two men, and at other times as a fragmented interpolation in the mind of the narrator as he goes about his own life and interacts with different characters in different contexts. The flashbacks and fragmentary disclosures of the story gradually generate an unmotivated fixation on Mustafa Sa'eed in the narrator's mind, so that he becomes both an enigma and an obsession for the narrator. By the end of the novel, the narrator begins to see himself as a mirror image of Sa'eed, and he's no longer at ease in his own village. The novel has many explicit and subtle literary echoes that are part of a larger symphony of mirrorings. They form a recurrent principle that ramify at different levels of the text, the first of which is between Mustafa Sa'eed and the unnamed narrator, as I have just mentioned. Intertextual references to Shakespeare's Othello, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, 1001 Nights, T.S.Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and many texts of the Arab Nahda, the Renaissance, are widely interspersed throughout Season of Migration to the North, such that to understand it properly requires from us a regular oscillation between what is laid out for us in the novel and the many references to world literature. At the heart of Mustafa Sa'eed's motivation in life is the drive toward self-authorship, that is to say, the ability to fashion his own identity autonomously and in complete control both of its contingent processes and of their final product. The problem of self-authorship is entangled with the process by which he becomes a highly successful intellectual in cosmopolitan London, as well as the precarities of intimacy between him as an Arab African and the many English women whom he lures into his bed. That Sa'eed later marries, then kills his English wife Jean Morris in an extraordinarily sensual ritual murder on their marriage bed immediately invites comparison with Shakespeare's Othello. As we shall see in a moment, Saleh's novel replicates the essential tragic morphology of Othello through the handkerchief that is used to focus the all-consuming, passionate love-hate relationship between Sa'eed and his wife. And even though at his trial, Mustafa Sa'eed is at pains to disavow Othello, I am no Othello, Othello was a lie, everything he does up to the court scene has been in the direct invocation of his literary predecessor. The interpellation of the colonial subject that Fanon writes of in The Fact of Blackness that we discussed in last week's episode is in Season of Migration to the North replaced by a form of co-constitutive Orientalism that situates the colonizer and the colonized in a relay of archetypes, with sexual desire warping the process of interpellation at various points. I use the term archetypes in preference to the more conventional stereotypes to indicate the ways in which the former draw upon a reservoir of the collective unconscious and thus raise intimations of cross-cultural transcendence. As the scholar Muhammad Siddiq adroitly argues, Mustafa Sa'eed is regularly invested with epiphanic and transcendental force throughout the novel, whether amongst the Sudanese or amongst the many English women he consorts with. This suggests that there are deeply felt impulses that come to be focalized through Mustafa Sa'eed for both groups on different sides of the colonial divide. At the same time, Sa'eed's character is extraordinarily elusive and the cause of great bewilderment to everyone that interacts with him. He stirs in the English woman deeply buried feelings that go beyond their individual consciousnesses. And for the Sudanese characters on encounter with him, the sense that they are being transported beyond their immediate material surroundings and into a domain of transcendental significance. However, whereas the English women he sleeps with, such as Isabella Seymour, Sheila Greenwood, and Anne Hammond, all subscribe to the relay of Oriental archetypes by which he lures them into his bed, his wife Jean Morris strips him of the Orientalist props to his identity and attempts instead to elicit from him a different kind of archetype, namely that of the aforementioned Othello. To become Othello, however, requires the enactment of a tragic action that involves both killing his English wife and killing himself, something that Mustafa Sa'eed implicitly acquiesces to, but then fails to completely accomplish in its second aspect. It is this failure that ultimately reveals to him the limits of his self-authorship and for which he lives the rest of his life in deep sorrow and regret. Mustafa Sa'eed's second mode of self-authorization derives from the total affirmation of his intellect as autonomous from the domain of ethics. Early in his studies in Cairo, he realizes that his mind is capable of grasping incredibly complex mathematical problems with the utmost ease. He learned to write in just 2 weeks, after which he surged forward with nothing to stop him. The dominant images by which he describes his mind are invariably of coldness and sharpness. My mind was like a sharp knife, cutting with cold effectiveness. My brain continued on, biting like the teeth of a plow. My sole weapon being that sharp knife inside my skull, while within my breast was a hard, cold feeling as if it had been cast in rock. Mrs. Robinson, the adopted mother whom he first meets in Cairo with her husband when he arrives there to study, tells him, Mr. Sa'eed, you are a person devoid of a sense of fun. Can't you ever forget your intellect? Even though he does not answer her question directly, his continuing fascination with his intellect is couched in terms that suggest the degree to which he's completely enamored of it, almost as if his mind was a technical tool independent of him. I was busy with this wonderful machine with which I had been endowed. I was cold as a field of ice. Nothing in the world could shake me. He goes on to become a star student at Oxford University, a lecturer at the University of London, a popular speaker on the lecture circuit, and a writer of hefty academic books, as well as a painter, a photographer, and a poet. If we discern here echoes of Conrad's Kurtz, and that, like Kurtz, all of European civilization went into making Mustafa Sa'eed, we are not entirely mistaken, for as we shall see presently, the interlocutory relationship between Mustafa Sa'eed and the unnamed narrator is similar to that between the extremely enigmatic Kurtz and the restless and intrepid Marlowe in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The image of a knife that is used repeatedly as a metaphor for his cold intellect is manifested in the real knife by which he murders Jean Morris. In the sexualized ritual scene of his wife's murder, the knife becomes a phallic object of inexpressible desire. He places the knife on his wife's chest and presses down on it in imitation of love making. Later in the novel, another character called Bint Mahmoud also uses a knife to castrate Wad Rais in the bloody murder-suicide scene in the narrator's village of Wad Hamid. This murder-suicide itself becomes a central turning point for the radical unsettling of the narrator's unexamined attitude to his village life world. Each mention of the knife in the novel thus establishes a connection with Mustafa Sa'eed, either directly or by implication. The cumulative insistence on the knife, first as a metaphor of mental capacities, then as phallic symbol, and finally as the instrument of castration, serves to situate it as one of the most suggestive, incrementally repeated symbols in the novel. More importantly, the knife also establishes the inextricable coupling of knowledge with desire and death, which are expressly bifurcated in both the metropolitan and colonial settings of the novel. To the women that encounter him, Mustafa Sa'eed is the Arab African of mystery and enigma. They invariably perceive him as the embodiment of some supernatural force and extension of nature. He is alternatively described as a pagan god, the devil, a symbol of Africa and the Nile, and of tropic climates. His color is said to be the color of darkness and magic, and his character is taken by the women to invoke untamed wildness, danger, unbridled energy, and tantalizing promise. That they consume him as an Oriental archetype does not foreclose the fact that he himself actively induces the process of his own interpellation through a series of material and discursive invocations that point in the same direction. The process of Oriental invocations is superbly encapsulated in his relationship with Anne Hammond, a student of Oriental languages at Oxford, whom he meets after delivering a speech at the university. And this is what we see. And so it was with us. She, moved by poetry and drink, feeding me with sweet lies, while I wove for her intricate and terrifying threads of fantasy. She would tell me that in my eyes she saw the shimmer of mirages in hot deserts, that in my voice she heard the screams of ferocious beasts in the jungles. And I would tell her that in the blueness of her eyes I saw the faraway shoreless seas of the north. In London, I took her to my house, the den of lethal lies that I had deliberately built up, lie upon lie, the sandalwood and incense, the ostrich feathers and ivory and ebony figurines, the paintings and drawings of forests of palm trees along the shores of the Nile, boats with sails like dove's wings, suns setting over the mountains of the Red Sea, camel caravans wending their way along sand dunes on the borders of the Yemen, baobab trees in Kordofan, naked girls from the tribes of the Zandi, the Nuer, and the Shuluk, fields of banana and coffee on the equator, old temples in the district of Nubia, Arabic books with decorated covers written in ornate Kufic script, Persian carpets, pink curtains, large mirrors on the walls, and colored lights in the corners. To the saturated and intoxicating appeals to the senses that include those of smell, sandalwood and incense, sight, the diverse paintings, the hint of victuals, fields of banana and coffee, and with a tintillating nod to the intellect, Arabic books with covers written in ornate Kufic scripts. And Hammond replies, "You are Mustafa, my master and my lord, and I am Sasan, your slave girl." It is not clear what classical female character from Arabic literature Anna Hammond is referring to here, but the Arabic word jariya, translated here as slave girl, is more technically an odalisque, that is, one of the many sex slaves in the Sultan's harem. This would lend significantly more power to the word master and also has a specifically Orientalist element of drama and spectacle coming from the mouth of Anne Hammond. Ironically, the tragic reversal and the concomitant anagnorisis or recognition that attends it are firmly brought together for Mustafa Sa'eed with his wife Jean Morris, who encapsulates the high point of the co-constitution of Oriental archetypes between the English woman and Mustafa Sa'eed. She flips the power dynamic between herself and Mustafa in ways that he could not quite have anticipated. Her game requires the employment of archetypes that serve to convert the usual patterns of sexual pursuit, normally under his complete control, and into an instrument of his own hounding by her and vice versa. For Jean Morris, Mustafa Sa'eed is both hunter and quarry, an oscillation that distorts his carefully managed process of self-authorship. Their relationship is defined very early as one of predation that is starkly different from what had existed between him and the other English woman. From first encounter, Jean Morris seems to stalk him as though she made a point of being where I was in order to humiliate me. She teases him while also repaying any acts of violence from him with even greater violence of her own. When I slapped her cheek, She kicked me and bit into my arm with teeth like those of a lioness. Rather, Jean designs to interpolate Mustafa completely anew, even against his will. She activates the Othello archetype through the most universally recognizable device of Shakespeare's play, the handkerchief. Once I find a man's handkerchief, which wasn't mine. "It's yours," she said when I asked her. "This handkerchief isn't mine," I told her. "Assuming it's not your handkerchief," she said, "what are you going to do about it?" On another occasion, I found a cigarette case, then a pen. "You are being unfaithful to me," I said to her. "Suppose I'm being unfaithful to you," she said. "I swear I'll kill you," I shouted at her. "You only say that," she said with a jeering smile. "What's stopping you from killing me? What are you waiting for? Perhaps you are waiting till you find a man lying on top of me. And even then, I don't think you'd do anything. You'd sit on the edge of the bed and cry." This is a deeply Shakespearean provocation indeed. Jean Morris's design is to invoke Mustafa Sa'eed as Othello, not merely as a process of Orientalist interpretation, but in order to elicit from him a different form of aesthetic self-expression. It is almost as if she's saying to him, "I know you have laid on a false performance of your identity all your life, and that you have fooled many women with it. But now I challenge you to be the real thing. Be as passionate and as great as Othello, you ridiculous and pathetic fake." In Shakespeare's play, Othello had what amounted to an all-consuming passion for his wife and a sense of absolute duty regarding his commitments to Venice. But for Mustafa Sa'eed to become Othello and Jean Morris his Desdemona is also to articulate their relationship through a specifically tragic structural morphology that must issue in both their deaths. It requires not only that Sa'eed kill his wife as the surrogate of Desdemona with the skin of monumental alabaster, as Othello describes her in Shakespeare's play, but that he kill himself in place of the turbaned Turk, that is Othello. This also implies that Jean Morris has an inherent death wish through which she might invest her life and her death with a special meaning via the idiom of tragedy. However, as she intuits correctly, Mustafa Sa'eed is incapable of playing the tragic role she assigns him. He just does not have the guts to go the full length of it. And we might ask, why should he? As we might recall in our discussion of Fanon, for him, the various negative interpolations of the colonial racial economy have the effect of frustrating or blocking the bodily schema of the black self, thus engendering fear and forms of discombobulation that then requires eternal vigilance as a coping mechanism. The model of interlocution implicit in black skin, white masks has the inherent structure of a call and response sequence. First, the hailing and interpellation, then the response and resistance. Repeat. Contrastively, in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which is more directly attuned to the problem of collective self-making in the crucible of colonialism and decolonization, Fanon calls for a righteous violence that is designed to fill the colonized with a sense of being and purpose. The co-constitutive Orientalism we see in Season of Migration to the North means that, unlike Fanon, Mustafa Sa'eed's response to the European orientalizing of his otherness is not through a process of incessant refutations, but rather through the activation of these stereotypes and archetypes for his own pleasure and benefit. Said does not refute the Oriental archetypes, but actively encourages them as part of the process by which knowledge, sex, and control come to be inextricably intertwined in his own process of self fashioning. He is only washed over by guilt when he kills his wife, but fails to kill himself, thus short circuiting the Othello archetype by which he had crafted stories of exoticism to appeal to other English women. At the end of the novel, we are ushered via the narrator into Mustafa Sa'eed's library, and there we see that he has firmly located himself within the Western archive, but also sought to critique it from the inside. As we browse the bookshelves along with the narrator, we see a long list of books from Gibbon, Macaulay, Bernard Shaw, Maynard Keynes, Thomas Hardy, Thomas Mann, Virginia Woolf, Wittgenstein, Einstein, and many others, down to the titles of his own books. The Economics of Colonialism by Mustafa Sa'eed, Colonialism and Monopoly by Mustafa Sa'eed, The Cross and Gunpowder by Mustafa Sa'eed, The Rape of Africa by Mustafa Sa'eed. Even though he's no Fanon in terms of the critical self-awareness that is required to unmask the terrible effects of everyday racism, Mustafa Sa'eed is what the Caribbean scholar David Scott might describe as a conscript of modernity. That is to say, both deeply resentful of the West for the damage it has imposed on the colonized psyche, but also deeply attracted to its project of enlightenment. For Mustafa Sa'eed, the contradictions are expressed at both the scholarly and the personal levels, but it is at the level of sex and intimacy and through the interplay of Orientalist archetypes that his desire for self-authorship is finally undone. Next week, we're going to undertake a Fanonian reading of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice and how we might interpret the apparent anti-Semitism of the play. Thank you very much. Please remember to give a thumbs up if you like this episode, subscribe and share, hit the notifications bell so you don't miss any upcoming episodes, and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.